Okay, we're on DAF Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, and it's not complicated. It's just a lot of information. So I just want to review what we were talking about yesterday. There are three separate halachas that we were talking about that the Torah addresses where geula is described as an option. The word geula means redemption, that you can, once something has been relinquished from your possession, you have the opportunity to redeem it back, to purchase it back at a prorated price. The three halachas that we were talking about yesterday is number one, sdei achuza, a piece of real estate, a regular plot of real estate. There the Torah says that if you want to be able to redeem it back, you have to come up with kidei geula, so the full purchase price. The next case that we had was batei arei choma, houses in walled cities. Special case, because it's not considered to be like ancestral property. It's just an expensive house that you built in a walled city, and therefore the Torah has a different set of criteria. There the Torah also allows for redemption, but you only have 1 year in which to buy it back. By a sdei achuza, you have up until Yovel to buy it back. If you don't buy it back, it automatically reverts to you at Yovel. Batei arei choma, you only have 1 year to buy it back. If you don't redeem it by the 1 year, it is permanently lost to you. The Gemara's question that was raised yesterday is, for batei arei choma, do you have to come up with the full purchase price, or can you come up with a partial redemption if you can only scrape together that much money, and then you become a partner in ownership in that property, the house in the walled city? The Gemara had presented a machlokes in this halacha between Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim. Rabbi Shimon says that you are able to come up with a partial redemption, and the Chachamim say you cannot. And that was the way we left it yesterday. The third halacha that we saw yesterday was a person who declares something to be hektish. There too, the Torah says you can be goel, you can redeem it back. You have until Yovel, if you are makdish real estate, you have until Yovel to redeem it back. And if you don't redeem it, then you forfeit your real estate permanently. It becomes temple property and is divided up by the Kohanim who work in the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, those are the three halachas. Now the Gemara had cited a brisa yesterday that had made a logical argument. And the logical argument of the brisa, going according to the Chachamim, that batei arei choma, you also have to come up with the full redemption price in order to redeem it, had made a logical argument. The Torah says, im gaol yiga alena. It uses a double language to teach that when it comes to hektish, a partial redemption, if you can only come up with a percentage of the value of the hektish property to redeem it, that's accepted by the temple, and you get that percentage of the property back. It's only derived from the words im gaol yiga alena. That double language implies that we allow you to redeem it in any way that you possibly can. The reason why, says the Brisa, that you need a pasuk is because if I didn't have a pasuk, I would have made a logical argument from the fact that if I can only come up with the full redemption price for batei arei choma, then that must also be the case by hektish as well. And why is that? Because these are two examples where the seller is at a distinct disadvantage. In what way is he at a disadvantage? Well, by selling batei arei choma, you're at a distinct disadvantage because if you don't redeem it within the year, you lose it permanently. Well, the same disadvantage, what we call hura kocho, exists for hektish. If you don't redeem it within the allotted time, you lose it permanently. So therefore, I would have argued without the pasuk that just like by batei arei choma, we don't allow you to come up with a partial redemption, the same thing would be true by hektish. And that's why you need the pasuk of im gaol yiga alena. That's all we need to know for now. Let's take a look now at the Gemara. We're at the Gemara on the seventh line on DAF Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. Amarle Rav Acha Sabel Ravashi. Mishum, we're on the fourth line on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. Amalei Ravacha Berei Derav Ravashi Ikal Mifrach. But what kind of comparison are you making between batei arei choma, houses in walled cities, and a case of hektish? Mala mocher bayis bebatei arei choma shekain hurakocho ligoel laolam. Tomar b'makdish sheyafa kocho ligoel la'olam. The Gemara says the Bryce's logical argument is not a fair one, because just because you can't come up with a partial redemption for Batei Orechoma doesn't automatically indicate that you would not be able to do so for Hektish. Why? Because we see that by Batei Orechoma, the seller is at an even greater disadvantage because he only has a year in which to buy it back. By Hektish, you have all the way La'olam, you have many, many years. You have up until Yovel in which to buy it back. So just because partial redemption doesn't work for Batei Orechoma doesn't automatically indicate that it's not going to work for Hektish. So Amalei Rav Acha Sabel Rav Ashi Mishum De'ikal Meimar Nihader Dina Teisei B'me'atzad. So basically Rav Acha Saba says, you're right, Rav Ashi. If we were only making a logical argument from Batei Orechoma, your argument would be a good argument. However, what we're doing is we're creating a tzad hashava. We're basing it on two laws, whether the seller is at a disadvantage, and we're taking the commonality between those two laws and applying it to a case of hektish. Mocher stei achuza yochiach sheyafa kocho ligoel la'olam ve'in loy v'gol lechatzayin. He says, because it's true that by Batei Orechoma you're at an even greater disadvantage. But look at stei achuza, look at when you sell a regular piece of real estate, a field. In that case, you also have until Yovel to redeem it, and you have plenty of advantages, and still the Torah does not allow you to do partial redemption. So from there, looking at the two things together, that's where you get it. But the Gemara says, Mala mocher stei achuza shekein huro kocho ligoel miyad. But the Gemara says, but wait a minute, there's a distinct disadvantage, a unique disadvantage by stei achuza that doesn't exist by hektish. What's the disadvantage? When you sell a field to another yid, you have to wait a full 2 years before you have a chance to buy it back from him. That doesn't exist by hektish. If I makdish something, 5 minutes later I can buy it back from hektish. So maybe the disadvantage that I have to wait a 2-year waiting period for stei achuza is the reason why I have to come up with the full purchase, the full redemption price. But maybe by hektish I can do a partial. So mocher bayis b'batei orechoma yochiach. But then go to the other case, the case of when you sell Batei Orechoma, a house in a walled city. There is no waiting period, and still we put you at a disadvantage. V'chazer adin lo re'izeh ki re'izeh, v'lo re'izeh ki re'izeh, hatzad hashava shebahen, shenigolen vein lo v'gol lechatzoyin, afani avi makdish, shenigal vein lo v'gol lechatzoyin. So the tzad hashava between the two cases of stei achuza and Batei Orechoma is that in both cases, even though each one has distinct disadvantages, but the commonality between the two of them is that when you sell them, you have the opportunity for redemption, but the Torah only permits redemption for the full amount and does not allow a partial redemption. Based on those two, we can apply that to hektish also, where the Torah says you can relinquish it and you can redeem it back, but you must come up with the full redemption price. And so that's the reason why we need a pasuk to tell you that based on this tzad hashava, without a pasuk, I would have said that there's no partial redemption for hektish. Kamashmal on the pasuk of Gaol Yigalena that you can come up with a partial redemption. Amrle Marzutra Bereda Rav Mari Ravina Ikala Mifrach. Mala hatzad hashava shebahen shekein hu rakocham ligoel b'shana shniya tomer b'makdish yafakocha ligoel b'shana shniya. But I can still poke a hole in even the tzad hashava that creates a commonality between the two laws of stei achuza and Batei Orechoma, because even jointly they have a unique weakness that does not exist by makdish. What is the unique weakness that they share? That in year 2, after you sell the property, you cannot redeem it. What do we mean? When I sell a stei achuza, I have to wait a full 2 years before I can redeem it back, which means that if I try after 18 months, let's say, to redeem it back, that's in the second year after I've sold it, I'm not able to redeem it. I have to wait till year 2 is finished before I can redeem it. By Batei Orechoma, it's already too late because the year limit has passed. So they share a weakness that in year 2 after its sale, I'm not allowed to redeem it back. And yet by hektish, I can redeem it back in year 2 very easily, just like I can redeem it in year 1 and year 20. So therefore, maybe that's the reason why you have to come up with full redemption price in those 2 cases, and you don't have to by hektish. So Amarle Ravina, Mishum De'ikala Meimar, Evet Ivri Hanim Karlo V'Kolchavim Yochiach, Sheyafe Kochel Ligol B'Shana Shnia Vein Lova V'Gol V'Gol L'Chatzoin. So your answer, the Gemara says, yes, you're right. Let's bring in a third exemplar and conjoin it with the Tzad HaShaveh. The third halacha is when an Eved Ivri is sold to a Goy. There the Torah says that Eved Ivri is subject to redemption, and there's no restriction on when you redeem him. You can redeem him in year 2. And there too, as we had established yesterday, the Torah requires you to come up with his full redemption price. And therefore, when you put all 3 together, you create a tzad hashavah that in all of these 3 halachos, you have to come up with a full redemption price. Our assumption would be the same thing would apply to hektish, and that's why you need the pasuk of Go'ol Yigalena to teach me that this is the exception to the rule. Now let's go on. Ba'aminei Rav Huna bar Chinina me Rav Sheshes. Here's the following question that was asked of Rav Sheshes. Hamocher bayis b'botei arichoma nigal lekrovim omein nigal lekrovim. When you sell a house in a walled city, is there an opportunity for the relatives to redeem it, or must it only be redeemed by the seller himself? Now, the basis of this question is that the Torah in other halachos mandates for relatives to perform the redemption when the person himself is not capable of doing the redemption. But we don't find that allowance by Batei Arechoma. So that's the question. Gu'ulasu mistei achuza gomar, mastei achuza eina nigelis lechatzon v'nigelis lekrovim, af hainami ein nigal lechatzon v'nigal lekrovim, o dilma ki ksiva gu'ula b'chatzon hu dichsiv b'krovim lo ksiv. The question is like this. The Torah allows for geula, for redemption, both by fields that you sell and for batei arechoma. So maybe just like by Sedei Achuza, where the Torah allows for a relative to redeem, so too it will allow for Batei Orechoma, for a relative to redeem. Or perhaps no. Perhaps the only time that we create a connection is to restrict the law of redemption, that you must come up with the full redemption price, not a partial redemption price. But as far as other comparisons between the two, they're not comparable. And therefore only by Sedei Achuza does a relative have the option of redeeming, but not for Batei Orechoma. So Omar Lei Eino Nigal. So Rav Shesh's response is, you're right, they're not the same. You can only have rights, a relative has rights of redemption for Sedei Achuza, but not for Batei Orechoma. Now when you think about it from a logical standpoint, now realize we're a bunch of city slickers, and so it's very hard for us to distinguish conceptually between Batei Orechoma and Sedei Achuza. But when you think about real estate from in an agricultural society, a piece of land that you inherit from a family inheritance for farming is much more attached to the family than a house that you build in a walled city, which is really not moored in that much of a way to the location itself. It's really, the house is really moored to the walled city more than it's moored to that particular plot of land. And so that's the reason why conceptually a relative can step in for a field that you sell because it's part of our mishpacha, right? Whereas by Batei Orechoma, there's a very good argument, logical argument to be made that a relative has no shaychus, he has no connection to it.
Roots. There's real roots.
No roots, exactly. Very good.
Agricultural roots.
There you go. So Eisve, so Rav Sheshis, you say that relatives cannot redeem Batei Orechoma. So what about the following brayse? It quotes the pasuk. Now there's a very vague pasuk that appears in this whole Parshas Bechukosai, which talks all about these laws, and it says, "Uvechol eretz achuzaschem geula titanu la'aretz," that in all of your ancestral land there shall be redemption for the land. And it doesn't really indicate what it's talking about, because we talked already about redemption. So this pasuk seems to be totally superfluous. So the Brisa says, L'rabos batim ve'eved ivri. It's coming to tell me that not only is there geula in all of the aforementioned law, but there's also geula for houses, and for eved ivri, and for a Hebrew slave, not only when he's sold to a Gentile, but even when he's sold to a Jew. That's the end of the brisa. So the Gemara's assumption is, my lav bote arechoma. It sounds like the brisa is telling me that redemption is possible for bote arechoma, implying that even relatives can redeem. So it's a kasha on Rav Sheshes. So the Gemara says, lo bote chatzerim. No, it's referring to houses that are on ancestral fields, on an open plantation. So the Gemara now says, bote chatzerim behedjiksif buhu al sadeha aretz yechashev. But the Gemara says, but the pasuk said explicitly beforehand in Parshas Bechukosai that any structures, any houses that are on ancestral fields have the same halacha as the fields themselves. So if the Torah says that the field itself can be redeemed by relatives, then you don't need an additional pasuk to tell me that the house can be redeemed by relatives. So the Gemara answers, Hahula kovo chova va'aliba de Rebbe Eliezer. Answers the Gemara, this Bryce is going according to Rebbe Eliezer, that the pasuk is coming to repeat it to tell me that not only does a relative have the option of redeeming an ancestral property, but he actually has an obligation to redeem the ancestral property. Now, what do we mean by that? Now, he has to step in if he sees it's going to be lost from the seller. He's got to redeem it. Tanya, and here's the brisa that we see a machlokas where Rabbi Eliezer chimes in. It says, "Vego'alas mimkar achiv." The Torah says that if a relative of a person who's poor has the ability to redeem his brother's or his cousin's property, he shall do so. So rishus, that only is giving you permission to do so as a relative, not an obligation. Ata omer rishus oine lechova. Maybe you'll say no, maybe it's an obligation. So Talmud lomar v'ish ki lo yihiyeh lo goel. So look at another pasuk in Bechukosai. It says if a man does not have a redeemer, so then if he can get the money himself, so he should redeem it. So the Gemara says, V'chi yesh adam b'Yisrael she'ein lo goyalim. Since when is there a person who inherits property in Eretz Yisrael who has no redeemers? All natural-born Jews who have a portion in Eretz Yisrael have relatives. I guarantee you, everyone who was born a Jew has a Jewish relative. There's no such thing as not having Jewish relatives. So how can you tell me that if a man does not have anyone as a relative to redeem? That's impossible. So So that pasuk causes Rabbi Yehoshua to conclude it doesn't mean that he has no relatives. It means that he has no relatives who want to redeem the property. So that proves that it's not an obligation, it's an option. I remember my mother, when she first came to the United States, she was looking up people who had her maiden name, because her maiden name was Stolzberg. So she finds a shopkeeper who's the last name Stolzberg, and she goes to him, my name's Stolzberg too. He said, we're not related. because the fear was after the war, with all the greeners coming to the New World, you're going to start mooching off of me, right? So,
especially a storekeeper.
That's right. So it's the same. So the Torah is saying, if you're a relative and you want to redeem it, gesundher hate, but you're not obligated to do so. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer, v'ga'alas mimkar achiv choiva. So Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. He says, no, a relative is obligated to redeem the ancestral field. Maybe you'll tell me, no, it's optional. So that's where we quote this abstract, this vague pasuk. Rabbi Eliezer learns that pasuk is coming to establish an obligation for the relative. That's why it repeats this idea of redemption. Not only is it optional, but it's obligatory to redeem. Now, Amri le Rabbanan le Ravashi, va'amri lo Ravina le Ravashi. So the challenge is now presented to Ravashi. You're telling me now, it was suggested that Rav Sheshes had suggested that there's no mitzvah of redemption for Batei Orichoma for relatives. Relatives are not able to redeem Batei Orichoma, they're only able to redeem ancestral property. So the challenge to Ravashi is Bishlam Lamanda Omer L'Rabos Batei Orichoma Hainu Dichsiv Bakol Elo Lamanda Omer L'Rabos Batei Chatzera Mai Bakol Kasha. The kasha is on Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says the pasuk does not allow for relatives to redeem batei arichoma. So this leads to a question. The question is, why then in that vague pasuk, uvechol eretz achuz aschem, does it use the word bekol? Throughout all of your properties in Eretz Yisrael, there shall be redemption for relatives. If you're telling me that the redemption law for relatives only applies to certain properties and not to batei arichoma, why does the Torah use the word bakol? The Gemara says, you're right, it's a kasha. We don't have an answer for that. Let's go on. So, Eisvei Abaye. Abaye now brings another challenge. Ma tamulomar yigalenu, yigalenu, yigalenu gimel pa'amim. The Torah talks about an Eved Ivri who is sold to an Akum, sold to a Gentile. The Torah there says there's a mitzvah for his redemption. And it says the word yigalenu, you shall redeem him. It says it 3 times in that parsha. Why does it say it so many times? So the Gemara answers, the Brisa answers, L'rabos kol hagu'ulo shenigolos keseder hazeh. It's to tell you that any time redemption is mentioned, it should be redeemed in the same format that the redemption is listed by the Eved Ivri who sold to an Akum. So that's the end of the Brisa. So Abaye says, you see from there, my love, bate orichoma ve'eved ivri. Doesn't that tell you that just like an Eved Ivri who sold to an Akum, there's an opportunity for relatives to redeem him, so too by all properties, including bate orichoma and an Eved Ivri who sold to Yisrael. So that disproves Rav Sheshis. The Gemara answers, lo, bate chatzeru mustei achuza. The Gemara says, no, it's telling you that just like by an Eved Ivri who sold to an Akum, relatives redeem, so too do relatives redeem in the halacha of ancestral lands and ancestral houses, meaning houses that are built on a plantation. So, but the Gemara says, but that's written explicitly in the pasuk that relatives can redeem ancestral properties. So the Gemara says, no, you don't understand. When the Brisa says that we connect the law of an Eved Ivri sold to an Akum as far as redemption goes to these other halachos, it's not teaching me that just like over here a relative can redeem, so too over there a relative can redeem. We know a relative can redeem over there also. But it's coming to tell me that just like the protocol of relatives redeeming has a hierarchy to it, that you first go to the closest relative. The Torah says, O dodo, O ben dodo yigolenu, O mishe'er bisaro. The Torah says, first you go to the uncle, the closest relative. Can he redeem it? Fine. If he's not able to, then you go to ben dodo, you go to the cousin. And if the cousin's not able to, then you go to the next closest of kin. That's what the Torah is saying. Just like that hierarchy of protocol exists for the Eved Ivri who sold to an Akum, so too do you utilize that same hierarchical protocol when you're redeeming back ancestral lands. You first go to the closest relative, then the next closest, and so forth and so on. Heicha itmer de Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So where was Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's halacha first cited? On the following discussion, because the question was raised. We know that the Torah allows for relatives to redeem when an Eved Ivri is sold to an Akum. What about an Eved Ivri who's sold to a Yid? Is he subject to redemption by relatives or not? So aliba de Rabbi loti boilach damer misha enu nigal be'ela nigal b'sheish alma mifrak. So there's a machlokis in how you read the psukim. According to Rabbi, in a brisa that the Gemara just makes a reference to, Rabbi was cited as saying is that if a person is not redeemed by himself, he goes free in 6 years when he's sold to a Yid. And therefore, from Rebbe's language, it's clear that a relative does not have the option of redeeming an Eved Ivri who's sold to a Yid. But kitiboy lachaliba de rabbanon mai. Yalfinon sachir velo darshi yigalenu, o dilma yigalenu lazeh velo la'acher. The question is, according to the Chachamim, maybe they make a gzeira shaveh between an Eved Ivri who sold to a Goy and an Eved Ivri who sold to a Yisrael, because of the word Sachir that is written by both Parshios, and therefore just like over there a relative can redeem, so too by a Yid a relative can redeem. Or maybe no, the Torah says Yigalenu, which implies that there's only a mitzvah for a relative to redeem him, meaning he who is sold to a Gentile, but not he who is sold to a Yid. So Tashma. So let's resolve this. The Brisa says, B'chol geula titanu l'rabos batim ve'eved ivri. Once again, we go to this vague pasuk that we cited originally, and it says over there, B'chol geula, that every redemption you shall have the opportunity for relatives. And that includes houses, and it includes an Eved Ivri. So, my lav bate orichoma ve'eved ivri anim karli Yisrael. Doesn't that imply that even walled cities and an Eved Ivri who's sold to a Yid is subject to the same kind of redemption by relatives? And that answers our question. Lo, Eved Ivri hanim karlo ovi kochavim. No, it's referring to an Eved Ivri who's sold to an Akum to tell me that he's subject to redemption by relatives. But the Gemara says, Eved Ivri hanim karlo ovi kochavim bejik sivbei. O dodo uven dodo yigalenu. But doesn't the Torah stated explicitly by an Eved Ivri who sold to a goy that a relative is supposed to redeem him? Hahu l'kovo chova. The answer is, says the Gemara, that this vague last pasuk is coming to tell me not only is it optional for a relative to redeem an Eved Ivri who sold to a goy, but it's obligatory for a relative to redeem an Eved Ivri who sold to a goy. And furthermore, says the Gemara, Va'afilu l'Rebbe Yehoshua. That's true even according to Rebbe Yehoshua. Why? Because Rebbe Yehoshua, if you remember, said before that a relative vis-a-vis redeeming ancestral property, he has the option, but he's not obligated, according to Rebbe Yehoshua. But Rebbe Yehoshua would agree that when it comes to an Eved Ivri who sold to a goy, there's an obligation for a relative to redeem him so that he should not remain in an assimilated state living with an idolater. Toshma. So the discussion continues and it says, look at the next brisa. Matamulomar yigalenu, yigalenu, yigalenu gimel pamim. Why does the Torah say by an Eved Ivri who sold to an akum that the relative shall redeem him? And it uses the word yigalenu 3 times. L'rabos kol ha'gu'ulo shenigalos kaseder hazeh. It's to tell me that all other redemptions have the same protocol as the redemption by an Eved Ivri who sold to a goy. My lav bate orechoma ve'Eved Ivri animkar liYisrael. Doesn't that imply that redemption by relatives is applicable for bate orechoma and for an Eved Ivri who sold to Yisrael? Lo bate chatzerim ustei achuza. So the Gemara says no. It's very similar to our previous conversation. It says no. The pasuk is saying that just like by an Eved Ivri who sold to an akum, the redemption is possible by relatives, so too by ancestral properties, redemption can be done by relatives. So the Gemara says, "Behedjik sivbahu al stei haaretz yechashev," but that's written explicitly in those contexts. Why do you need an extra pasuk of Yigalenu? Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak lekarov karov kodem. So that's where Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak had originally cited his halacha. The reason why the Torah says Yigalenu multiple times is to tell me that the hierarchical protocol that is listed by the Eved Ivri who sold to a goy applies to all other areas, where all other laws where the Torah allows for relatives to redeem. So just like by the Eved Ivri who sold to an akum, you go to the closest of kin first, and then if he can't, you go to the next of kin. So too, you do the same thing by ancestral properties. A distant relative is not obligated or does not have even the opportunity to redeem unless you go to a closer relative first. Now let's go. We'll go through the rest of this Gemara a little bit more quickly. Now we're changing gears and we're talking about the Eved Hanirtza, which was also discussed by our Mishnah. The Eved Hanirtza is the Eved Ivri who says after 6 years of servitude, I love my master, I want to stick around. And the Mishnah had said, Hanirtza nikna beritzia, that how is he acquired permanently? Through piercing his ear. And the Gemara just points out, as the Torah says, the master shall pierce his ear with an awl, A-W-L, if you know what that is. Anyone ever see an awl before? It's a piercing instrument that is used, I think, by leathersmiths.
To make holes.
Right, to make holes in, right. So, and the Torah says, and through that process, va'avado le'olam, and he shall be his servant forever. V'kones atzmo b'yovel u'v'misa satan. How does he go free? He goes free with the arrival of Yovel, or with the death of the master. D'chsiv va'avado v'lo es habein v'lo es habas. And how do I know that he doesn't get passed as an inheritance to the master's children upon the master's death? Because it says, va'avado, his slave, not the slave of his children. La'olam, it says that he shall be his slave forever. La'olamo shel yavu, that means not forever literally, it means forever until the end of the Yovel cycle, because after all, the Torah says that by Yovel, everyone goes free. Tanu Rabbona, Martseya. So now let's look at this brisa. Martseya is an awl. Ein li elo martseya, minayin l'rabos hasol v'hasira v'hamachat v'hamakdeach v'hamachtev. So the Torah only allows for the piercing instrument to be an awl. How do you know that a soul, now a soul is a wooden puncturing instrument, can be used? How do you know that a sira, which is a thorn, can be used? How do you know that a needle can be used? How do you know that a makdeach, which is a drill bit, some kind of boring instrument, can be used? And a machtev, which I would translate as a stylus, which is something that you use on a tablet, not on an iPad, an original tablet, right? A tablet back in the day where you would have to engrave. An engraving instrument is a stylus, right? How do you know that those can also be used to pierce his ear? Talmud loymar v'lo kachta L'rabos kol davar shenikach biyad. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda answers because the Torah says you shall pick up the instrument. So anything that could be picked up to pierce can be used. I know, Bob, you're probably very concerned about sterility here, so I'm sorry. This is the way it is. Anyway, Rebbe Omer ma martzea miyuchad shel matechas av kol shel matechas. So Rebbe disagrees. He says, no, you cannot use just any boring instrument. It has to be specifically a boring instrument that's made out of metal, just like an awl. And we'll discuss later the basis of their machlokas. Davar acher. And then the Brisa continues and says, Hamartzeya, the letter Hey, L'Havi Hamartzeya Hagadol. It's coming to include even a large industrial-sized awl. That obviously that's not going to be a very pretty puncture. But apparently the Brisa says that because it says Hamartzeya, it implies that it doesn't matter even if the awl is not a personal-sized awl for small puncture holes, even if it's for large puncture holes, that too can be used. Amar Rebbe Eli Elazar, Yudan Beribi HaYadorish Kashen Rotzim and Rotzim Ela B'Milsa. The Brisa continues and it says now, changes topics, and it says that as far as where in the ear do you bore the hole? So Rebbe Elazar says that there was a man named Yudan who was a great Talmud Chacham, and he taught that it's in the earlobe, the soft part of the ear where there's no cartilage. So v'chachamim omrim ein eved ivri kohen nirtza b'pnei shenasa balmum v'im toimar b'milseim rotzim heich eved ivri kohen ye'asa balmum ha'ein nirtza ela b'goyva shel ozim. And the chachamim disagree, and they say, we'll prove to you that the boring of the hole is in the cartilage of the ear and not in the earlobe. Why? Because we know that there's a halacha that if a kohen is an eved ivri, we do not allow his ear to be pierced. Why? Because by piercing his ear, you're rendering him into a balmum. He's going to be blemished and will not be able to do the avodah in the temple anymore. So, if that's the concern, right, that he's going to become a balmum, and the piercing is done in the earlobe, that's not a permanent mum. I mean, every woman knows who gets her ears pierced that if you don't keep the earring in the lobe, it's going to close up. So it's only a temporary blemish, so what's wrong with piercing a kohen's ear? So it must be that the piercing is done in a place where the hole is permanent, which is in the cartilage. And that's how we know, according to the Chachamim, this is the machlokas. Yudan says that it's done in the earlobe, and the Chachamim say it's done in the cartilage. B'mai kamiflagi. What's the machlokas? So really going back to our original discussion regarding the nature of the awl. Rabbi Yossi had said that the awl can be any puncturing instrument, no matter what material it's made out of. And Rabbi said it can be a puncturing instrument as long as it's made out of metal. So what's the machlokas? The Rebbe Darish Klali Uprati. So the answer is this very famous discussion that we've seen a number of times in the DAF Yomi, where there are two schools of hermeneutics. One is called the Klal Uprat Uklal hermeneutic, and the other one is called the Riboy Miut V'Riboy hermeneutic. And it's basically two different approaches to deriving law from a unique sentence structure in the Torah. So there's two different schools among the Tanoim. One is the Klal Upratu Klal, which basically, and I'm going to go through this in a moment just to explain it. When you have a general statement followed by a specific, followed by a general statement, that structure in the sentence, if you learn the first hermeneutic school, indicates that everything that is part of this halacha has to conform exactly to the rules of the specific example that's given. But if you learn the Riboy, Miut, V'Riboy hermeneutic school, so then not every aspect of the law has to conform to the specific example. The reason why the specific example is given is to only require one restriction, but not multiple restrictions to conform to that one example. So that's the difference between the two. So Rebbe Darish Klali Prati V'lo Kachta Klal Martzeya Prat Ba'ozno Vadeles Chazer V'Kolal. He says if you look at the sentence structure, it's a Klalu Pratu Klal. It says take. That's the general principle. Then it says the all, which is the specific, and then it says bore it in his ear by the door, and that's a klal. So klalu pratu klal iyatadan elakein haprat ma haprat miforash shel matechas av kol shel matechas. Rebbe says in my hermeneutic school, you have to conform exactly to the example of the specific example that's given of an all. So therefore, just like an all is made out of metal and it bores, only metal boring instruments can be used to pierce his ear. However, Rabbi Yossi Darish Ribuye miuti v'lokachta riba martzea miet ba'ozno badelas charza v'riba riba miet riba hakol. My Rabbi kol mili, my miet sam. And therefore, in Rabbi Yossi's hermeneutics, the specific example of the all is not coming to limit it to be exactly like an all. It's only coming to require that in only one respect it has to be like an all. So all boring instruments are acceptable, and the only reason why the all is used as an example is to exclude only one category of things that make holes but do not do it in a boring fashion. Right? In other words,
Very interesting.
Also boring.
We're not.
right? Hope you're not bored. What do we mean by that? If something, let's say you have an acid, a chemical, that by putting it on his ear could make a hole, that's what is being excluded by the example of the all. But all other boring instruments can be used as long as they make the hole through the process of boring and not through the process of burning a hole. Okay, that's the way Rabbi Yossi learns, and that's why he says the instrument can be made out of other materials, even if it's not metal. Now, Omar Mar, Hamartzeya lahavi martzeya hagadol, my mashma. Then we said that the letter Hey of the word Hamartzeya comes to teach me that it can even be a large industrial-sized all. So where do you see that from the letter Hey? Kid Omar Rava hayareich the Torah says by the laws of the Gid Hanasha, the Torah says the letter Hey, the thigh. And there's one opinion that says that the sciatic nerve is forbidden in only one out of the two thighs of the animal. Which thigh is it? The more distinguished or the more important thigh, because of the letter Hey. Hachanami hamartzeya meyuchad shebimartzein. So too, a large awl, which is a more distinguished, expensive instrument, can also be used, and that's, we learn it out from the letter Hey, which indicates even a distinguished item of that category can also be used. Amar Rabbi Lazar Yudan Berivi HaYadorish Kashein Rotzen Ein Rotzen Ela B'Milsa V'Chachamim Omer Menein Aviri Kohen Nirtzim Mipnei Shanasa Balmum. So then we saw the machlokas between Yudan and the Chachamim, that Yudan had said that you bore the hole in his earlobe, the soft fleshy part without cartilage, and the Chachamim said no. The boring renders a person into a Balmum, so it must be in the cartilage. So the Gemara says, V'yeyasa balmum. So the Gemara says, but why can't a Kohen get his ear pierced even if he'll be rendered a balmum? After all, you're in the course of doing a mitzvah. So what if he comes home a balmum? So he won't work in the temple anymore. The Gemara answers, Amar Rabba bar Rav Shila, Amar Kra, V'shavel mishpachto l'muchsuk shebemishpachto. It's based on the pasuk. The Torah says that after a person has his ear pierced and after Yovel arrives, he shall go back to his family. Meaning that he has to go back to his family status. Just like he was a working Kohen who was able to do avodah in the Beis HaMikdash before he became a slave, he has to be capable of returning to that status after his servitude is over. And that's how we know that he cannot have his ear pierced in the cartilage. Ibayilahu evet ivri Kohen mahu sheyimsa lo rabba shivcha kenanis chidushu lo shna kohanim v'lo shna Yisrael odil mashani kohanim hol v'riba b'hen hakosov mitzvos yiseres. Now a related subject, which is what if a Kohen is an evet ivri? Okay? And it's within the 6 years. We're not talking about his ear being pierced, right? We know that there's a law that a master can give his Evet Ivri a shivcha kenanis, a Gentile servant, to consort with to be able to produce babies. Does that apply to a Kohen who's an Evet Ivri as well, or does it only apply to a Yisrael? On the one hand, you could argue the whole concept is novel, and if it's a novelty, because normally a Yisrael cannot marry a Gentile, but here the Torah gives specific allowance, so it's allowance to everybody, including Kohanim. On the other hand, says the Gemara, we know that a Kohen is more restricted in the women he can marry, so maybe here too he's restricted, and only allowance is made for a Yisrael who's an Evet Ivri, not a Kohen. So Rav Omer Mutter, Shmuel Omer Aser. Rav says a Kohen is allowed to have a Shivcha Kenanis, and Shmuel says he cannot. So Amar le Rav Nachman le Rav Anan ki havisu beimar Shmuel beis kumadri itlalisu. So Rav Anan was very. Rav Nachman said to Rav Anan, "I'm very bothered by the way you're quoting Shmuel. When you were by Shmuel's yeshiva, you must have been playing around with games, and you weren't listening properly."
Your phone out.
What?
You had your phone out.
You had your phone out. You were distracted. You were playing with an app, right? So You know why? You know how I know? It's impossible that Shmuel would have said that a Kohen can't have a Shivcha Kenanis. You know why? Because my time lo semru le meha. He says, because I could prove it to you from the following. V'chachamim omrim ein evet ivri Kohen nirtza mipnei shanasa balmum. V'im tomer in Rabba Moselo Shivcha Kenanis tepuk le divo'ina hafti es aduni es ushti ve'es banai v'leka. So he says the argument that you could have presented to Shmuel would be like this. He says, according to you, Shmuel, a Kohen Evet Ivri cannot have a Shivcha Kenanis. So don't tell me that the reason why a Kohen cannot get his ear pierced is because it's going to render him a Balmum. Give me a much more basic reason. The reason why a Kohen Evet Ivri cannot get his ear pierced is because he cannot say the words that the Torah describes that an Evet is going to say when he wants to get his ear pierced. What are the words that an Evet says? I don't want to leave because I love my wife and my kids that have been given to me since I've been an Evet Ivri. I love my Shivcha Kenanis. Can a Kohen say that according to you, Shmuel? He can't say that because according to you, he's not allowed to be given a Shivcha Kenanis. So that's the reason why he can't get his ear pierced. Not because he's going to become a Balmum, but because he can't possibly say, Ahafti es ishti ve'es banai. Okay? So therefore, Sulomidi. And the Gemara says Rav Nachman's question was so powerful that there was no response. And therefore, that's why we don't paskin like Shmuel, we paskin like Rav, that a Kohen Evet Ivri is allowed to be given a Shivcha Kenanis. Iboyalu. Now another question. Kohen Mahu B'Yafas Toar. A related question. We know that in Parshas Ki Teitzei, the Torah says that when you go out to war and you meet a beautiful woman on the battlefield who's a Gentile, the Torah gives you permission to marry her, even though normally you're not allowed to marry an idolatrous woman. So the question is, does that apply to a Kohen who's a warrior on the battlefield, or only to a Yisrael? Chiddushu lo shna Kohen v'lo shna Yisrael, o dilma shayni kohanim hol v'riba ben mitzvos yiseros. Same question we had by the Kohen Evet Ivri. Do you say that it's a chiddush, it's a novelty, and therefore it applies to both Yisraelim and Kohanim alike, or do you say no? Since we know that a Kohen is more restricted and who he can marry, the law does not apply to him. Rav Omer Mutter, Shmuel Omer Asur. Same machlokas. Rav says a Kohen can marry a Yafas Toar, and Shmuel says the Kohen cannot marry a Yafas Toar. So the Gemara now says, "Bebir Rishona dekuli amalo pligi deshari delo dibra Torah ela keneged yetzer hara ki pligi bebia shnia Rav Omer Mutter Shmuel Omer Asur." The Gemara now clarifies. The first act of intimacy, when a man first meets her on the battlefield and he's overcome with the intensity of a Yetzer Hara, because that's the whole reason why the Torah makes the allowance. You're out to battle, tensions are running high, your Yetzer Hara gets the best of you, so Hashem says, I'll make an allowance. But Hashem will only make an allowance for the first act of intimacy. Once you've calmed down, by the second act of intimacy, that's where there's a machlokas. The Rav says you can eat. So everyone agrees that a Kohen is allowed to indulge his Yetzer Hara when he first meets her on the battlefield. The machlokas between Rav and Shmuel, whether he's allowed to continue staying married to her, Rav says you can continue, and Shmuel says you cannot. So Rav Amar Mutter Hol v'Ishtarya Ishtari Ushmuel Amar Asur Dahahavu lo Gioris v'Gioris lo Kohen lo Chazia. And the basis of the machlokas is that Rav says, listen, once the Torah permits her, it permits her to you completely. And Shmuel says, no, the Torah only permitted you to her because of the intense Yetzer Hara. But now that she's converted to Judaism, a Kohen is not allowed to marry a convert, so therefore you have to get rid of her after the first intimacy. Ika da Amri, others learn that no, Bibia Shnia Kuli Amalo Pligi de Asira, Dahavila Gioris, Ki Pligi Bibia Rishona, Rav Omer Mutter. So the machlokas is only for the first intimacy. Everyone agrees that by the second intimacy where the Yetzer Hara is calmed down, even Rav would agree that she's Asur because she's a convert. A Kohen can't be married to a convert. The machlokas is for the first intimacy. Rav says it's Mutter, Dahalo Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzer Hara, because a Kohen is just as much of a Yetzer Hara as a Yisrael, and therefore the Torah permits her. But Ushmuel Amar Asur Kol Hecha de Karina Beiva Havesal Toch Beisecha Karina Beivera Isa Bashivya Kol Hecha de Lo Karina Beiva Havesal Toch Beisecha Lo Karina Beivera Isa Bashivya. But Shmuel argues, he says no, the Torah connects the two. The Torah says you can take a Yafas Toar and then bring her into your house. So you have to be able to bring her into your house after the war is over, in order for this law to be applicable to you. But if you can't bring her to your house because she's a convert and you can't stay married to her, then even the first time you're not allowed to be married, to be intimate with her. That's Shmuel's position. Now, Tanu Rabbanan, let's look at the Brisa. V'ra'isa b'shivya, this Brisa goes through the exact words of the pasuk. The pasuk says, "You shall see a woman being taken captive," and what that teaches me, bishas shivya, that it tells me that the only time we give you permission is that when you first take sight of her at the time when she's captured as a prisoner. If, let's say, on Tuesday she's captured as a prisoner, and then Thursday you take notice of her beauty, it's already too late. It's only on the day that when she's taken captive does the Torah give you permission. Eishes, and it says a woman who is a beautiful woman. The Torah says the word Eishes to imply va'afilu Eishes ish, even if she's married, the Torah supersedes her marriage to her Gentile husband and allows you to take her as a wife. Yefas Torah, she's beautiful. Lo dibra Torah ela keneged yetzara. Those words, Yefas Torah, beautiful of appearance, teaches me that the Torah is allowing you to indulge your Yetzirah. Why? Mutav sheyochlu Yisrael basar temusos shechutos va'al yochlu basar temusos nevelos. Because the answer is like this: the Torah's attitude is that this is a disgusting piece of flesh, meaning in a figurative sense, meaning that look, the Torah permits you to eat diseased meat, but that's a diseased animal. If you need to eat the diseased animal, better that you should shecht it so that it's kosher, instead of eating it when it's in a state of treif and when it's in a vela. Don't let it die. So in other words, it's a terrible thing to eat diseased meat, but if you're going to at least do it, eat it by shechting it first instead of letting it be carrion. So the same way, the Torah says, look, you shouldn't really be indulging your Yetzirah, but I know that you're overcome by it. It's like it's uncontrollable. So if you're going to do it already, let me give you a heter to do it in a permissible fashion by allowing you to do it according to the parameters of the law and not do it in a forbidden fashion. Then the word is v'choshakta, if you shall desire her. And what that word teaches is that afal pi she'ena no'eh, even if she's ugly. In other words, it's a subjective desire. Even if this woman will never make the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine, nevertheless, if she's beautiful in your eyes because you desire her, the Torah, she doesn't have to have objective beauty. She has to have subjective desirability to you. And ba, velo ba uvachaverta. The next word is that you shall desire her. Her implies that you can only take one. There's no double dipping here. And velo kachta, you shall take her. Likuchen yesh lecha ba. The Torah's chiddush is, even though normally a woman cannot be forcibly converted and forcibly married, here in this case the Torah makes a unique allowance. Lecha leisha, for you as a wife, shelo yikach shtei nashim echas lo ve'echas la'aviv. And lecha leisha tells me that she has to be only for you as a wife, which means that even if you're only interested in one, but let's say you see another beautiful woman, you say, hey, I'll take one for my father or one for my son. No, the Torah only allows you to take her for yourself. You can't have your friend in mind. And then finally, vahavesa, you have to bring her into your house. This teaches me that if you meet her at the first time when she's taken captive on the battlefield, we don't give you permission to just release your pent-up frustration on the battlefield and have intimacy with her right there. You have to take her to a place of abode and have intimacy with her there. You can't do it mamish on the battlefield. Have a wonderful day. A guten Erev Shabbat.